I just want to go back to this term poetic that I've used a few times, and I'm still wrestling with. And I'm particularly interested in relation to cognition, and what's sometimes called poetic cognition, or the reverse of that, cognitive poetics. Poetic cognition, as I understand it, is a recognition that most cognitive processes use the tools that we would normally think of as the tools of poetry. Things like metaphor, metanymy, synecdoche. The various tools that are traditionally associated with poetry seem to be the tools of thought. Cognitive poetics is kind of the other side of that, in which the tools of thought are applied. Those tools of thought are kind of applied to an analysis of poetic writing which declares itself as being poetic. But I can just go back to the first of that, this idea of poetic cognition and its effect on its relationship to writing particularly. If there's any truth in that, and it's a disputed concept, that the tools of thought are the same tools which in other circumstances we would think of as the tools of poetry. And that's reflected, and here I'm kind of coming out of cognitive linguistics here, and that's reflected in the language we speak. The language we speak, as Stephen Pinker said, is a window into human nature, and human nature, human cognition being poetic, is inevitable that the language we speak is also poetic. And I think the evidence for that is in the prevalence of, for example, metaphor in our language. I've read different estimates of anything up to something like 90% of language being composed of metaphor. Most of it covert, most of it non-conscious. An endless kind of stream of metaphors to do with containers and conduits and journeys and substances and objects and machines and all kinds of different metaphors being brought into play. Metaphors like being brought into play, for example. So let me just see if I can catch up with myself here. So large parts of cognition are poetic. Language we speak, being the window into that human nature, are also poetic. So what's the difference in that case between the kind of language I'm using now, which is intended to be relatively straightforward, even if it's failing in the attempt, between that kind of language and language we do call poetry, the subject matter of cognitive poetics, the subject matter of all the interpretive and aesthetic strategies that apply to poetry. I think in terms of an analysis, and this is something Stanley Fish talks about, which I've mentioned before, you'd be very hard pressed to find formal differences, to look at a piece of poetic writing and know for sure that you were looking at a piece of poetry, or vice versa, look at a piece of technical writing or a piece of writing completely out of context and be able to say whether it was poetry or not. Certainly a lot of contemporary poetry doesn't use any of the traditional signifiers of poetry to do with rhyme and scansion and all those kinds of things. So the difference I suppose the difference really is just, this, in a sense I think this is just a kind of replaying out of that discussion that happened in the visual arts in the 20th century, really, to do with experiments with found objects, experiments with random processes, experiments with kind of non-traditional objects and processes, which basically, it's just a series of experiments to say that art is a kind of category experience, or is available as a category experience for cultures that want to go there, which we seem to want to. And I think the same thing must apply for poetic writing in that sense. It seems perfectly possible to take a piece of writing as a found object, and here I'm reminded actually of a guy I met recently who was a visual artist. He made artworks, but he also did kind of stand-up comedy. And one of his stand-up comedy routines involved reading parts of Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, just passages from that. He had a good delivery, so they came across as jokes for some reason. So these lines in Deleuze and Guattari presented at a microphone in a comedy club sounded like jokes, which is just great, I think. But I suppose it's about context, really. It's just about context. We've decided that we can, that we want to create these special places, these special environments, these special conceptual frames around things, which detach them from our workaday life and which allow them to be examined in a different way and experienced in a different way, perhaps in a way which is safe, I don't know. And then put various things into that space. So we put found objects into that space. We put found sounds into that space. Occasionally it's in a musical environment. And we can put pieces of language into that conceptual space. And when we do that with pieces of language, I think we do call it poetry. Or we can choose to call it poetry.